never take our freedom!
Well, if you've ever watched the movie Braveheart, you'll know the Scots are a fiercely proud and freedom-loving people, and it's been that way for centuries. But as of this month, they live under a new law, the Hate Crime Act, which some say does take away their freedom. Coming up on the show, we'll ask our panel of experts what you can now say and not say under the new legislation. But first, a quick look at what's going on in Scotland. The Hate Crime Act has only been in effect for a few weeks, and there's already been well over 9,000 reports of people breaking the new law.
Police Scotland cannot cope with the demand.
7,000 reports came in the first week. Police promised to investigate every single one of them, but only 9 were looked at under the new stirring up offence, and most of those were dismissed on further investigation. Fewer than 1 in 1,000 reports from the first week are still being investigated under the new law. And that's because, as anticipated, many complaints are spurious, including against Scotland's First Minister, Humza Yousaf, who backed the law from the beginning. He's been accused of breaking it with this little tirade against white people in Parliament.
The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The head of the Law Society, white.
It's been reported that far-right agitators are making copious quantities of vexatious complaints to overwhelm the police and to annoy Humza Yousaf. As if anticipating this deluge, police set up hundreds of little call centres in third-party premises, including a salmon wholesaler, university campuses, and even in, shall we say, stores just for adults. Scots can report so-called hate crimes anonymously if they wish, and they don't even have to be the alleged victim.
You can't be offended on behalf of someone. Feelings are non-transferable.
Not only are police struggling to keep up with the sheer number of complaints, in many cases they don't even know how to apply the law in practice. On the face of it, it's quite clear. There are 7 protected characteristics covered in the Act: age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender identity, variations in sex characteristics, and race. But the threshold for the new offences, which carry sentences of up to 7 years in prison, requires that behaviour is proven to be threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. Police say stirring up hatred is not well defined. The new law then is proving difficult to police. It's also said to harm free speech. There may be 7 protected characteristics, but it's gender that's grabbing most of the headlines. And that's down in large part to JK Rowling, the celebrated author, who dared the police to arrest her on the day the Act became law.
The only people who don't hate crimes are Nazis and children's fantasy authors.
Scotland's Hate Crime Act comes into effect today. Women gain no additional protections, of course, but well-known trans activist Beth Douglas, darling of prominent Scottish politicians, falls within a protected category.
Rowling tweeted a series of images of men identifying as women in order to enter women-only spaces. And then she wrote,
April Fools! If what I've written here qualifies as an offence under the terms of the new Act, I look forward to being arrested when I return to the birthplace of the Scottish Enlightenment.
Rowling's stance has attracted international public support from the likes of Joe Rogan and Elon Musk.
See that wild that's going on in Scotland?
Musk tweeted that the new law is an example of why it is so important to preserve freedom of speech. But Humza Yousaf is having none of it, saying the Act is necessary and definitely doesn't interfere with free speech.
This bill is about protecting people against that rising tide of hatred we see far too prevalent in our society nowadays. Unless your behaviour is threatening or abusive and intends to stir up hatred, then you have nothing to worry about.
Okay, let's bring in our guest now, and today we have Calum Steele, former General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, Thomas Leonard Ross KC, who's a top trial lawyer in Scotland, Fraser Hudghton, the Director of Free Speech Union Scotland, and for an international perspective, we have Juneitha Shambee, an attorney from Chicago and member of the First Amendment Lawyers Association. Welcome to all of you. Thomas Leonard Ross, you've been part of hundreds of trials in Scotland's highest court. What are the main problems you've identified with this new law?
The language which is used in the new law is fairly confusing. I should say it probably doesn't make such substantial changes to the law as has been claimed by some quarters. The offences of which can result in aggravations to existing offences have been introduced over a number of years in Scotland. And actually, the new part of the legislation extends the offence of stirring up racial hatred to other protected categories. And what's confusing about it is, on the one hand, it seeks to criminalise that conduct. On the other hand, it uses wording which is intending to protect the right of free speech, and obviously thereby introduces a balance. And in any particular situation, it's exceptionally difficult to say which side of the line any particular conduct might rest upon.
Absolutely. And the most famous challenge to the new law has come from JK Rowling. And Police Scotland has decided not to prosecute her, or to take it any further anyway. Why do you think they took that decision in this case?
It never occurred to me that it came anywhere near the test for stirring up hatred against a particular group. So I was unsurprised. I mean, it's quite a high test. I'm unaware. There's been the law of stirring up racial hatred in Scotland since 1965, which was almost 60 years ago. I'm unaware of a single prosecution for it in Scotland. I've told there were 3. There have been a few in England, but really it's quite extreme conduct, usually by far-right groups using extreme language against Jews or blacks, or in some cases Muslims. So it never seemed to me likely that it would get anywhere. JK Rowling's statement, which was provocative and clearly designed to test the legislation. But I don't think there was a single lawyer in Scotland thought that breached the new act.
Well, you say that, but of course a former prosecutor, Rajan Barrott, advised her to delete her posts on Twitter, saying they most likely do contravene the new law. Doesn't that just demonstrate how unclear it is?
I mean, lawyers can take different views of different situations. I don't think that gentleman is a Scottish prosecutor. I'm not sure how familiar he is with Scottish legislation. If he's as familiar with Scottish legislation as I am with English legislation, then he's not very familiar with it.
OK, fair enough. Calum Steele, as the former General Secretary of the Scottish Police Federation, you're in a good position to answer this, I believe. Are the police clear about the new law and how to implement it?
Well, I think they're getting clearer as the days pass by, but to begin with, I think they were far from clear and made something of a dog's breakfast of their own communication. Not only with the public, but also with the officers that they have serving under them. On one hand, the police service was saying to the general public that they were training everyone to be prepared for this new legislation, which clearly had significant implications for the police service. And then very late in the day, the messaging was that, much the same as Mr. Ross was just saying a few moments ago, that very little is changing, everything's the same, and nobody's got any need to be worried about it. But of course, within the police service, there are those that will have diametrically opposing views on interpretation as to what legislation means. And whilst I agree with Mr. Ross about the very low likelihood of there being a swathe of prosecutions as a consequence of this legislation, I do not have the same confidence that that's not necessarily going to bring lots of people to adverse police attention as a consequence of allegations made that certain behaviours amount to new hate crime offences.
Well, we'll come to that in a minute, especially the non-crime hate incidents. But before we do that, Fraser, Hudghton, you anticipated the new law would have a chilling effect on free speech in Scotland. Why is that, and has that been the case in the first few weeks?
Well, I think that's something which will progress and become a reality over time. Our view very strongly is that the policing of thoughts and speech is a dangerous road to go down. We've already seen with Police Scotland's statistics out yesterday that there's almost 10,000 reports been made to the police force in the first 3 weeks of its the Act's existence. And that is troublesome. I mean, 600 of them have been picked up and recorded as hate crimes themselves, but those are lots and lots of complaints flooding in, and we anticipate at some point prosecutions will follow. We do think over time this will make people pause and think twice before they express themselves. In many ways, you know, Edinburgh Festival is an internationally renowned arts event, world famous, and actors, comedians, playwrights I have already said in the public domain that they're thinking twice about the kind of material that they'll be looking to relay at that festival. Those are troubling things to hear about Scotland, and we are worried about them. And the test, of course, will be when prosecutions follow at some point, which we expect they will.
Juneitha Shambee, as a lawyer living in America, where free speech is protected by the First Amendment, what do you make of this new law?
Well, as we know, First Amendment here is such a important right for us, and we have to be very careful when crossing that line on when to limit that right that's given to every individual. It runs the gamut. We have to really use a balancing test on whether or not the speech that is being limited will protect the individual as well as protect the person at which it is spoke against. And so here we allow the courts and we allow our legislative branch, our judicial branch, in order to like really vet out and categorize and sort out where hate speech is, as opposed to just leaving it up to the police alone. In order to make that determination, we leave it up to the courts.
Could it have been passed in the United States, or would it have been struck down as unconstitutional?
I believe that as long as if it passes the balancing test that we use here, as long as if there was a legitimate reason that it was enacted, we don't have a comprehensive hate crime law that encompasses all states. Each state has some form of hate crime law, and there are some that are coming from the federal government as well. Nice. But a law such as this, there needs to be very defined and clear rules in order to put everyone on notice of what is considered hate speech. And I'm not stating that in our laws everything is defined, and so we've had time over our history to allow the courts to further define legislative intent on what's considered hate speech, what's considered limited speech, and what falls under total freedom of speech.
Right. Thomas Leonard Ross, you did mention at the beginning of the programme that some of the fears reported in the press were overblown. Can I take something from the Telegraph, one of the biggest, most read articles on this? How Scotland became an Orwellian nightmare. And it goes on to say, imagine living in a world where sitting in your own living room and saying men can't be women could result in the police logging a hate incident against your name if somebody perceives it to be offensive. Is that a reasonable headline that they put out there?
It might be a reasonable headline, but I should say the logging of non-crime hate incidents has absolutely nothing to do with the new legislation. It was actually a response to the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, as I understand it. And the notion was that police throughout the United Kingdom should make a record of hate crime. And they've been doing that. And I must say, I mean no criticism of the police, but not many people were aware of the fact that they were doing this in Scotland until there was a fairly high-profile situation in respect of a serving MSP in the Scottish Parliament who discovered that a hate crime incident had been logged against him in relation to something which he had commented on Twitter. Right. So that I would actually think that is the most disturbing aspect of the whole debate, that nobody's very sure what might lead to the police recording a hate crime. And, there has been a review in a case in England which suggested that the English and Welsh policy in relation to it went too far. And the Scottish police have been aware of that for 2 years. And so far as I know, haven't taken any steps to reform their policy in response to the English case.
So in that case, you mentioned the MSP. I think it's Murdo Fraser, is that correct? And
that's right.
And he said in public, he said something along the lines of thinking that a person thinking that they're non-binary is essentially the same as them identifying as a cat. and he was reported for that. This was before the new law came into effect, and the police recorded it as a non-crime hate incident. Now, given the new law that came in on April the 1st, would he have been prosecuted, perhaps?
Definitely not. I mean, that's not a crime. Nobody seriously would suggest that was a crime, no.
Right. He went on to say that he felt that the police were acting illegally and were potentially in breach of the Human Rights Act and the Data Protection Act. Is that true?
I don't think so. I mean, the English case seemed to accept it was a legitimate aim to record hate crime, but they thought that by recording, with no sifting, in other words, recording everything as a hate crime, if somebody thinks it's a hate crime, which seemed to be the English policy, that was going too far. So in other words, there was a legitimate aim to be pursued in recording hate crime, but they had to be a bit more careful in the way it was done.
Yeah, Calum Steele, another issue that's been brought up is that police are said to be overwhelmed by the number of reports since April the 1st. Is that true, that they're overwhelmed? And is it also true that they're diverting resources, no longer investigating certain lower level crimes, and they're diverting resources to handling and fulfilling their pledge that they would investigate every single report of alleged hate crimes that they receive?
Well, in some respects, the police service has been a victim of its own narrative when it came to the issue of hate crime, and it's certainly fair to say that in the first number of weeks, the volume of hate crime incidents that have been reported, or alleged hate crime incidents that have been reported, were probably off the charts. Some 8,000 or so, I think, at last report, or very close to 8,000. Now, very obviously, that number of incidents being reported is going to require to be serviced in some way, shape, or form. The police service was not set up to deal with that 8,000 additional complaints, so resources had to come from somewhere to deal with it. But the reason that this is a problem of the police service's own making is just a few short weeks before this legislation came into effect in Scotland, the service had very publicly announced that it was not going to be investigating all other, well, not all other, that's an exaggeration, a large proportion of other minor crimes. So in some ways, the service has kind of put itself on a hook here, having told the public that they're not going to investigate certain crimes, and then a few short weeks later telling the public that based upon the individual's own perception, they would investigate every single incident that would be reported to them. That is problematic in terms of what it means for the legitimacy and the confidence and the trust in the police service, not least given where I suspect the general consensus lies in Scottish discourse about what the priority should be. And without diminishing the effect of hate crime to those that are affected by genuine hate crime, the investigation of hurt feelings, which I think is a large part of where much of the antipathy towards the legislation comes from, is something that the police service could easily have avoided had it got its messaging right to begin with.
Can we just pause for a second and take a look at Scotland's First Minister? And we heard earlier that a number of people have actually reported him for allegedly breaking his own law when he complained as Justice Minister that too many top official positions were held by white people. Let's have a listen to that first, and then I'll have a question for the panel.
That 99% of the meetings I go to, I'm the only non-white person in the room. But why are we so surprised when the most senior positions in Scotland are filled almost exclusively by those who are white? Take my portfolio alone. The Lord President, white. The Lord Justice Clerk, white. Every High Court judge, white. The Lord Advocate, white. The Solicitor General, white. The Chief Constable, white. Every Deputy Chief Constable, white. Every Assistant Chief Constable, white. The Head of the Law Society, white. The Head of the Faculty of Advocates, white. Every Prison Governor, white. And not just Justice. The Chief Medical Officer, white. The Chief Nursing Officer, white. The Chief Veterinary Officer, white. The Chief Social Work Advisor, white. Almost every trade union in this country headed by people who are white. In the Scottish Government, every Director General is white. Every chair of every public body is white. That is not good enough.
Well, given that 96% of people living in Scotland are white, some found this speech rather offensive and are accusing Yousaf of stirring up hatred against white people. In the past couple of days, it's also been revealed that the Scottish Parliament's official report misrecorded Yousaf's speech, inserting the word is 15 times in the transcript. So now Yousaf is recorded as saying, the Lord President is white, the Lord Justice Clerk is white, every High Court judge is white, etc., etc. Thomas, there have been complaints made against the First Minister for allegedly stirring up racial hatred. Is there any basis for those complaints? And why do you think they've not been taken on so far, taken further?
Well, I mean, I don't think ultimately that it does meet the test for stirring up racial hatred, although undoubtedly a huge number of people found it highly offensive. And I think the fact that the Scottish Parliament official record was amended, I mean, it seems to have been, it's not a typo if it happens 16 times. They clearly looked at the language that he used, where he spat out the word white with extreme vitriol, which offended quite a lot of people. And clearly the official record thought that that was problematic if they've amended it. But I don't think that it amounts to stirring up racial hatred. He is an extremely unpopular figure with quite a large number of people in Scotland, and I suspect they were sort of using that to bite back at him in some way by making the complaints. But I mean, I'm not saying that they were completely unfounded. It raises the question when somebody spits the word white out with such anger as he clearly did in the course of that contribution.
Well, Fraser Hudghton, as we've heard, the official record has inserted the word is they say to convey the meaning better. Others would say to soften what was being said at the time. What do you make of the records being changed like that?
I think that is very typical of the present administration in Scotland. It's exactly the kind of thing they would do. I mean, the wider point here about the volume of complaints against Mr. Yousaf points to the flaws that's in the legislation and the concerns that were raised, which is you're likely to receive a large number of vexatious complaints against people willy-nilly on this law. There's no surprise in that. That's only a follow-up to other similar snitching portals, which you'll see on many universities' websites, many employers' internal setups, which we already know have a big impact on people's employment, on their studies, where people can anonymously report individuals for various social indiscretions, shall we say, or going against the grain of what is perceived to be popular on social media and elsewhere, and it has a big impact on their lives.
Yeah, you mentioned snitching portals. The Police Scotland call them hate crime third-party reporting centres, where people can complain anonymously. Juneitha, I was just wondering, do you have such anonymous reporting centres in the United States?
Absolutely not. Any complaints that are towards criminality needs to go to any local law enforcement agencies. To have a private entity to take in complaints as these can be very dangerous. It can create a sliding slope. Also, even with anonymous complaints, there needs to be some sort of corroboration with those in order to prevent frivolous complaints, what some would amount to as swatting here, just as a way, as retaliation against individuals that they may have a problem with. So these complaints will be handled and taken to local police stations or law enforcement agencies, as opposed to local private companies or entities.
Thomas Leonard Ross, just a final question. We know that Fraser Hudghton would like to see the Act repealed. Is there any chance of that? And if so, how would anyone go about doing it?
I don't think there is any chance of it, because the Scottish Labour Party, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and the SNP all voted for this. So unless the Scottish Conservatives are able to increase the number of seats in Holyrood by a factor of about 10,000 in the next election, they are the only party who are committed to abolishing it. So, although the SNP take most of the blame for it, undoubtedly the blame shared amongst the four main parties who all supported the act as it was making its way through Parliament.
Well, there's no chance of that happening, but there you go. Thomas Leonard Ross, Fraser Hudghton, Calum Steele, and Juneitha Shambee. Thank you all very much. Appreciate it. And thank you at home and on your phones for watching. If you want to see this episode or any of our previous episodes, do go to our channel on YouTube. Just type in Nexus, TRT World. Till next week, then, goodbye.